Welcome back, Python pioneers. If you missed lesson 1 in the previous video, please click the link above and go back and watch that now. In that video, we covered some of the basic concepts such as entering expressions into the interactive shell. We looked at some of the operators that you could use. We talked about integers, floating point, and string data types. It's very important that you're familiar with these concepts, so go ahead and watch that video now if you haven't. But assuming you already have watched it, let's jump right into the next video. So in this video, we're going to jump into an idea called variables. And I want to talk to you about that, but before we do, I think it's important that we talk about the order of operations. I didn't mention it in the last video because I kind of just wanted you to focus on the core concepts first. But it's also important to mention that when you're writing out those operators and creating expressions, they follow the same logic you learned in math. PEMDAS. And I'll have my AI guy explain that to you.
Hello coders. Today, let's unravel the mystery of the order of operations in Python. Think of it like the PEMDAS rule in math. In Python, the order starts with parentheses to group expressions. Then comes exponentiation, like 2 * 3. After that, we have multiplication and division, including integer division and modulus, and finally, addition and subtraction.
I don't know about you, but I think I need an example. I think we need to do a couple of these order of operation examples in the terminal real quick in our interactive shell. So we'll hop over there now. And I have some spoilers here for you that we will talk about in a minute. So stop that. Okay. So let's just go ahead and click REPL. Okay. So just like my AI guy talked about, if we have 3 plus 5 divided by 2. In this example, because of the order of operations, just like in math, 5 divided by 2 will be evaluated first, because multiplication and division come before subtraction and addition. However, if we wanted to evaluate 3 plus 5 first, all we have to do is wrap it in parentheses, just like you would on a calculator. Other than that, if you're not familiar with PEMDAS, go ahead and brush up on that. But for the most part, you can really avoid even having to understand how PEMDAS works if you just use parentheses. You can use parentheses to make each part of it happen the way you want it to, and that works just fine. It won't slow your code down at all. It's totally fine to do that. So feel free to add in parentheses anytime you think it would help with the readability of your code. I would even argue it's probably better that way. You don't want to have to read your code and have to think. You really want your code to just read almost like a book. So parentheses are totally fine to use. Okay. That does it for order of operations and PEMDAS. Now we're going to jump over to variables. All right, let's talk variables. I'm going to throw it over to my AI guy to give you a brief description.
Hey there, future Python pros. Let's talk about variables in Python. Think of a variable as a name tag you stick onto a value. It's like when you save a contact in your phone. You store your friend's phone number under a name like Alex. In Python, you might have something like alex_number equals 12345678890. Here, alex_number is the variable, and it refers to the string 12345678890. Variables are super handy because they let you store, modify, and reuse values throughout your code. Just remember, they need meaningful names and can't start with numbers. Keep coding.
That's right. My AI guy said it perfectly. Variables cannot start with a number. So if I type out starting with 8, for example, and I say my favorite number. Notice, first of all, the syntax highlighting is trying to help you. The syntax highlighting is what changes the color for each of the different pieces of code that you type in. In this case, our variable name is yellow instead of white, like this variable name that my AI guy talked about. That's because it doesn't really know how to categorize this because it doesn't look like a variable. The number in the front is throwing off mu. So if I delete this 8, we're all good. Also, you can have underscores in the name. So one way to do it is to just separate every word with an underscore, not number. You can separate each word with this underscore, and actually that is what the official Python documentation recommends. I'm going to stick with camel casing. Actually, the Automate the Boring Stuff book also chooses to stay with camel casing. It just depends on the programming language you're using. There's no wrong answer here. It really just depends on what you prefer. If you would rather write your variable names out and space each word with an underscore, that is totally fine. I choose camel casing just because I come from a C++ background, and that is what I learned there. So camel casing is just, instead of an underscore, the very first word is lowercase, and then all subsequent words in the name are capitalized. In no case should you ever have spaces in a variable name. That's not allowed. Okay? And we can have numbers after the first letter. So anywhere in the name, I could put a number in and it would be completely fine. So we have letters, numbers, and underscores, not special characters and not spaces. So that would not be allowed. That would not be allowed. Just to show you a few examples. Okay. So just like my AI guide described, a variable is, just think of it like a place in memory that you can store an expression's value, whatever it evaluated to, and work with it again later. So, for example, my favorite number equals 7. Now, later on, I could say, I want to recall my favorite number. I don't have to remember what that exact number was. I just can use the variable. And I could say my favorite number equals a new number. I want to set my favorite number to the next number, whatever comes after the number that it previously was. So to do that, I can actually recall the number and say +1. So what this code does, on the right hand side of this equal sign, and that's a special sign. The equal sign is the assignment operator, and this is an assignment expression because we have the equal sign or assignment operator. The way that these expressions evaluate, they look at the right hand side of the equal sign and they treat this like a expression. And this expression is evaluated down to a single value, just like you practiced in the previous video. And whatever that single value is, it is assigned to the variable on the left hand side. So when this expression evaluates, it's going to see this variable name. What it's going to do is it's going to go into memory and look and see, well, what is the number stored in this variable? In this case, it's going to go and see that there's a 7. And the variable name, my favorite number, will be replaced with the number 7. Then 7 plus 1 will evaluate to 8, and 8 will be assigned to my favorite number. That's called overriding the variable. So when you do that, my favorite number will now equal 8. The previous value of 7 is gone. It no longer holds that value at all. Another really important thing to point out about the assignment operator and assignment expressions, you can't write expressions on the left hand side of the assignment operator. So what do I mean? I can't say my favorite number plus 1 equals 8. Now this is something that's maybe slightly counterintuitive to what you've seen in the past with your previous experience with math. And what you know from math in the past, typically this is what you might see. Like if we get rid of this line and we say my favorite number is 7. 7 plus 1, in regular math, 7 plus 1 is 8, which should equal 8. But that is not what we're doing here. So just remember that the equal sign is an assignment operator. It does not test for equality. And we will talk about testing for equality in detail coming up very soon. And just a sneak peek preview for you, the equality operator is equals equals. So a single equal sign is for assigning a value. You're setting a value into a variable. So the left-hand side of that assignment operator must be a variable, not an expression. And the right-hand side can be a single value. It can be an expression with a variable in it, like we saw. It can also just be a variable, another variable. So those are all perfectly fine. So the right-hand side, it's any kind of value is perfectly acceptable. So passing in a variable name will evaluate to a value and be assigned to the variable. Putting a value in will work just fine, and putting an expression in will work just fine. Okay. So that is, we kind of showed a pretty good example there with integers. The same applies for floating point numbers. So if I wanted to create a floating point number, all I have to do is add in that decimal, and now this is a floating point number. If you have any previous experience with programming, some programming languages might have you add in what is the variable type before you write out a variable identifier or name. But in Python, you don't have to do that. Python does all the hard work for you behind the scenes to figure out what kind of variable it is. So if you wanted to create a floating point number, we'll say my float equals 7.0. Alex's number. Now this is something that you could get caught up on. It says Alex's number. You might think this is an integer. It is not an integer. This is a string because it's in quotes. That brings up another great point to talk about. What if I have, we'll just call it my number. And I type out 99 in quotes. Now this is counterintuitive in some ways. So this is a variable that we are using the assignment operator and giving it a value of 99. But the 99 is a string value. So the nines are actually characters. You could not do math on this number because these nines might as well be actual characters like an A, B, C, or D. The quotes are what make it a string. And you can definitely have any kind of character in a string. So, A, all lowercase. You can have special characters, that's totally fine. Numbers, spaces, it's all allowed in a string. So that's another important nuance to talk about. Okay, so we have a string up at the top, we have a float, and let's go ahead and create an int or integer. All we do is type out 7 without that decimal, right? So we have our string, our integer, and our floating point number. Now, up at the top, you see this little hashtag sign or pound sign, and then the words after it are gray. That's called a comment. So when the code runs, the comments are not interpreted. The program won't try to run those lines of code. They're just comments for you to help you when you go back and read your code again. So let's add some comments to our code. String variable. Integer variable. Floating point variable. Okay. And hopefully you're following along with this. This is good practice. These are some of the things that it might take a minute to remember all the syntax for how you write this out, but that's okay. If you don't remember it right off the bat, it's perfectly fine to go and review these videos again or search for help on the internet. And if you do find yourself needing to search for help on the internet, the very first place I recommend is python.org. Python.org is the official website for Python. Let's pull that up now. All right, so we've got python.org open. There's quite a few tabs you might see up here at the top. You can scroll through and kind of see where do I get all of these different things. So starting with downloads, where you can download Python. Also documentation. Now this is a really good one. And community. Sometimes you can get some helpful information from the forums. But let's go back and let's look at documentation. There's several things here that are particularly useful. For one, there's a beginner's guide. And this is something that I actually thought about using as the guide for this course, but I ended up going with automate the boring stuff just because it was focused on projects and I thought that would be fun. But this is also another great place if you need additional resources along with automate the boring stuff. They have their own guide that they've written that you can go through and learn all you need to know about Python. So if you find yourself needing more material, definitely recommend checking this out. Now, the documentation. This is super, super important. If we click on Python docs, we see all the versions on the left-hand side. So whatever version you're using, you would want to click on that version to learn more about each of the different documentation available for that version. Now, while we're talking about versions, which one should you use? This depends highly on the modules that you use, which we haven't talked about yet. But the general idea is, like we talked about before, other people write code for you. They write code in what's called modules. And in the modules, all this code that they've written, you're able to use. But some of those modules are behind and they're not updated for the latest version of Python. So if you are using a particular module that might be slightly out of date, then you have to stick with an older version of Python. Generally, if it says stable next to it, those are the ones you want to try to use. You're usually fine using stable. And if you go any further back, you can see that there's security fixes that happened. And if you go with an older version, then that version is missing the security fixes in the later version. So let's click on, for example, 3.11. They have the tutorial which you can go through, even instructions on how to install those modules I'm talking about. And let's go to language reference just to show you. So there's data model objects, values, and types. And we're not going to go into the detail here. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. They're talking about integers, which we have learned about. There's some in here we haven't learned about yet, but that's okay. But you can see that they provide in detail descriptions about integer and in detailed description about floats. This can be very helpful when you start getting into the weeds in a program and you're like wanting to know, okay, I'm going to use this variable type, but I really need to know fundamentally how it works. I want to know exactly what's happening. You can come in here and actually read in detail about it. And I would honestly recommend using the Python documentation as much as you can. Another great place is Stack Overflow, but we're not going to jump into that right now. Maybe if we have a specific question later that we want to try to answer that way, we can. And that pretty much does it for python.org. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, ChatGPT. ChatGPT can write Python, and that's awesome. So why should you learn Python? There is a need for people who understand the Python programming language. And large language models like ChatGPT can generate Python, but they make mistakes and they lack the context of the overarching mission where you might be working, for example. And I think that ChatGPT is a great tool to use alongside programming. So you don't want to try to totally lean on it. It's kind of like a guide. You can use it to help you. If you have an error, for example, in writing your code, ChatGPT can help you debug that error. If you're struggling with a certain concept, ChatGPT can help explain that concept to you. But I would highly encourage you to take the steps to learn how to code on your own first. And then when you have the fundamentals down, using ChatGPT to help you write faster code even is very useful. But the number one rule always in coding, and this applies even if you're not using ChatGPT, but maybe you found some form and someone provided a response and it has code in it and you think it might fix your issue you're having or do what you want it to do. The number one rule: always understand the code that you're using. Don't just copy paste code and run it. Because if you don't understand how it's running, that's how you introduce bugs into your program, and that's how you introduce security vulnerabilities. So it's very important that you understand the code that you're writing. And for our case and what we're doing, the stakes aren't too high, but as you move on in your life and you get further along with your programming skills, it's very important that you understand how the code is working. And the building blocks that we're learning here will be the foundation for your programming endeavors moving forward. You'll take these concepts we learn here and they will translate directly over to other programming languages. So it's very important to take the time and try to learn the material. Don't lean too much on outside resources. Okay, that pretty much does it for this video. We have talked about order of operations. We've talked about variables and how to write a proper variable identifier or variable name. We looked at how can you find help at the python.org website. And we just talked a little bit about ChatGPT. I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.